Welcome to Professor Jeffrey D. Sachs' commentary. There are moments in human history when language itself begins to fail, when words designed to carry meaning collapse under the weight of what they are asked to describe. War is one of those moments. The announcement that Hamas says it has handed over all hostage bodies it can access is not merely a line of political communication, it is a eulogy for humanity's moral voice. When death becomes the only currency left to exchange, language has already lost its purpose. They are about exhaustion, the exhaustion of empathy, of diplomacy, of conscience. In the theater of modern conflict, the words of both sides have become mechanized, stripped of feeling, reduced to the sterile vocabulary of procedure. Bodies access handed over, these are bureaucratic terms for moral catastrophes. They reveal how power speaks when it no longer remembers how to mourn. The return of the dead, once a sacred act of mercy, now reads like a logistical update. The moral collapse lies not only in the act of war, but in the way it is narrated, how the vocabulary of compassion has been replaced by the syntax of indifference. Sachs might say that when language begins to sound administrative in the face of suffering, it is a sign that civilization has lost its pulse. Every corpse handed over represents more than a life ended. It represents a relationship broken, a future erased, a silence imposed. The phrase, all the bodies it can access, carries within it a quiet horror that even in death there are hierarchies. Some are found, others lost, some returned, others left beneath the rubble. War divides not only the living from the dead, but the mourned from the forgotten. He might say, is measured not by how it treats its heroes, but by how it grieves its enemies. In this moment, neither side can grieve the other. Both are trapped in the cold arithmetic of retaliation, counting bodies instead of blessings, negotiating sorrow, as if it were a matter of policy. The deeper tragedy is that language, once the instrument of peace has been drafted into the service of war, each statement, each press release, each televised declaration carries the rhythm of justification, not remorse. Words like weapons have become tools of precision meant not to heal but to manage perception. That the moral task of humanity begins precisely where politics ends. To speak truthfully about loss is not to declare victory or defeat, but to acknowledge the shared fragility that binds us. The dead, regardless of flag or faith, belong to all of us. Their silence is our inheritance, a reminder that beneath the noise of war, there was once a world capable of empathy. In the end, the phrase, all the bodies it can access, is more than a report. It is an epitaph not only for those who have died, but for the moral language that once made peace possible. Until we learn to speak again with compassion, every word will sound like a requiem. In war, the human body becomes more than flesh and bone, it becomes a message. Once it was sacred, the vessel of life and dignity. Now it is the final medium through which power communicates its intent. When Hamas announces that it has returned all hostage bodies it can access, what we are witnessing is not only an act of violence, but a form of speech, a grim dialogue between the living and the dead, between those who claim control and those who have lost it. In the collapse of diplomacy, the body takes the place of language. When words fail to mediate, corpses do. Each body returned is no longer a person but a symbol, a statement about territory, defiance, and revenge. The tragedy is not only that the dead are being exchanged, but that they have become the last negotiators left standing. In the moral order of civilization, death was once the boundary at which enmity ceased. To return a body was to honor the sanctity of life, to restore some measure of humanity in the aftermath of inhumanity. But today that gesture has lost its grace. The body is no longer returned out of mercy, but out of calculation. It has become a token in the marketplace of moral bankruptcy, proof that even compassion can be managed through policy. In Gaza, as in so many conflicts before it, the body becomes the battlefield after the battlefield. Its condition, its visibility, its delivery, all are measured, photographed, and reported. The dead are made to speak, though not in their own words. They speak through the hands that move them, the statements that frame them, and the power that decides when and whether they are seen. If we have the courage to listen, is not a political message, but a moral one. They are silent teachers reminding us of what we have forgotten, that no ideology is worth the price of a single life, that victory built on grief is no victory at all. There is an unbearable symmetry in this tragedy. For every body returned, another remains unrecovered. For every family that finds closure, another is condemned to uncertainty. This uneven exchange of the dead mirrors the uneven value we assign to the living. Some are mourned in state funerals, others vanish nameless into rubble. This moral imbalance is the essence of war, not merely the destruction of life, but the destruction of equality before death. In the end, the returned bodies are not messages of peace. They are reminders of our collective moral failure, the evidence that we have allowed the language of humanity to be replaced by the cold grammar of power. Each body wrapped and buried carries within it a question we refuse to answer. When did we stop seeing ourselves in the faces of the dead? Civilization survives not by how it fights, but by how it remembers. The body in its stillness demands that remembrance. It speaks a truth that no government can silence, that every war ends not in victory, but in mourning. Leadership at its noblest is the moral art of preventing suffering. Yet in our age, it has become the management of its consequences. When we hear that Hamas has handed over all hostage bodies it can access, we are not merely hearing of an atrocity concluded, we are hearing of a failure that began long before. This moment, tragic and bureaucratic at once, is the harvest of leadership, abandoned leadership that has traded compassion for calculation and vision for vengeance. When leaders lose the capacity to grieve, nations lose the capacity to heal, is not the assertion of dominance, but the stewardship of humanity. Yet as bombs fall and hostages die, the leaders of this generation speak as if they preside over numbers, not souls. The vocabulary of strategy, retaliation, ceasefire, security drowns out the vocabulary of empathy. The death of leadership begins with the death of imagination, the inability to envision peace, to see beyond the short-term theater of outrage and revenge. In Gaza and beyond, we are governed by those who have mistaken power for wisdom and outrage for courage. They speak of control even as events spiral beyond their control. They speak of justice but deliver only suffering, who warned that nations perish not by invasion but by the decay of conscience. In this war, the decay is visible in every speech that rationalizes violence and every justification uttered in the name of security. The leaders on all sides speak as if violence were inevitable, as if human cruelty were a law of nature, not a choice. This fatalism, Sachs would argue, is the greatest moral failure of all. Leadership requires the courage to imagine what does not yet exist: peace, where there is hatred; compassion, where there is fear. Instead, we see political systems that reward anger and punish empathy. In the corridors of power, the language of peace is dismissed as naive, and the language of restraint as weakness. The result is a generation of leaders who mistake destruction for resolve. Meanwhile, the people, Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider world, are left to bear the cost. The mothers who wait for their children's bodies, the children who wake to the sound of explosions, the families who receive coffins instead of answers, these are the victims not only of war, but of failed leadership. This, the moral void of governance. It is a vacuum where humanity should reside. In that void, decisions are made without conscience, and every tragedy is followed by another speech. The world listens numbed as rhetoric replaces repentance. True leadership does not seek applause. It seeks reconciliation. It does not celebrate the return of bodies. It prevents the need for their return. The absence of such leadership, moral, visionary, humane, is the deepest wound of our time. In the end, the leaders will stand before history not to explain what they did, but to answer for what they allowed. For when leadership fails, it is not politics that dies, it is hope. Every war builds a landscape of ruins, but its deepest wreckage is invisible. It lies in the conscience of humankind. The streets of Gaza are filled with the debris of buildings. The halls of power are filled with the debris of morality. When Hamas declares that it has returned all hostage bodies, it can access the statement may mark an operational conclusion, but morally it is a revelation that the human soul too has been buried under the rubble. Conscience is not an ornament of civilization. It is its foundation. Without it, technology, diplomacy, and law become instruments of cruelty. We can reconstruct cities, but not the moral memory of a world that forgets the sanctity of life. In Gaza, as in countless conflicts before the graves multiply, not only in the ground but in our collective spirit, each one a quiet indictment of our failure to feel. War destroys twice, first the body, then the meaning of the body. Once the dead were mourned as individuals, now they are tallied as data. Dozens killed, hundreds wounded bodies, returned the language of casualty, has replaced the language of grief. This is how conscience dies, not with an outcry, but with the dull repetition of numbers that no longer move us. The graveyard of conscience extends beyond the battlefield. It reaches into every newsroom that sanitizes suffering, every parliament that applauds violence under the banner of patriotism, every citizen who scrolls past tragedy as if it were a passing storm. The world's moral fatigue, its exhaustion with compassion, is the final victory of war. It ensures that when the next atrocity occurs, we will respond with resignation, not resistance. This moral decay is not inevitable. It is chosen. It is sustained each time a nation values pride over mercy, vengeance over empathy. The graveyards grow because we have learned to live with them, to normalize the abnormal, to call horror defense and cruelty justice. The erosion of conscience is the quiet price of civilization's comfort. The greatest tragedy of our time is that peace has become sentimental while violence has become pragmatic. We have learned to negotiate the end of wars, but we have forgotten how to prevent them. The moral voice, once the conscience of politics, has been exiled from diplomacy. Where are the statesmen who speak not of borders but of human beings, not of retaliation but of restoration? Their silence echoes louder than any bomb. And yet, even amid this moral desolation, Sachs would insist that the conscience is not dead, only buried. Beneath the rubble lies the same human capacity for empathy that built our laws, our faiths, our sense of right and wrong. It can be unearthed, but only if we dare to look into the graves we have dug and recognize ourselves there. Because the true graveyard is not in Gaza, nor in Israel, nor in any nation torn by war. It is within us in every heart that has learned to accept the unacceptable. The resurrection of peace begins not with treaties or armies, but with the awakening of conscience. For when conscience rises again, humanity does too. When the guns finally fall silent, the illusion is that peace has returned. But true peace is not the absence of noise. It is the presence of conscience. The rubble can be cleared, the treaties signed, the speeches made, and yet something irreversible lingers in the air, a quiet hollowness, as if the soul of humanity itself has been wounded. What remains after war is not victory. It is memory. Rebuilding cities is easier than rebuilding trust. That reconciliation is a deeper labor than reconstruction. The war in Gaza, like so many before, it will one day fade from headlines, but the moral scars will endure. They will live in the eyes of children who have seen too much, in the hearts of parents who have buried their futures. The ruins will be swept away, but the grief will remain passed quietly from generation to generation, like an heirloom of sorrow. What remains after war depends on what we choose to remember. If we remember only who was right and who was wrong, we will repeat the cycle. If we remember only the suffering of our own, we will remain divided. But if we remember the shared humanity that was lost in Gaza and Tel Aviv and every place where vengeance triumphed over mercy, then perhaps the memory itself can become a seed of renewal. Peace is not a political transaction, but a moral awakening. It requires a change, not of borders, but of hearts. And yet our world continues to mistake ceasefires for peace and dominance for justice. The leaders pose for photographs, their pens poised over treaties, while the families they govern remain haunted by absence. This is the great deception of modern diplomacy. It measures progress in documents, not in dignity. The true measure of civilization lies not in its capacity to wage war, but in its ability to mourn. To mourn fully, not selectively, not strategically, but universally. To see that every death, whether Israeli or Palestinian, is a loss to the human story we share. The act of mourning is in itself an act of resistance. Resistance against indifference, against the machinery of hate that thrives on forgetting. In the end, what remains after war is what we allow to remain. If we cling to resentment, we will inherit ruin. If we bury our empathy alongside the dead, we will become what we fear, a civilization efficient in destruction but incapable of compassion. But if amid the ashes, we still find the strength to look into the eyes of the other and see ourselves reflected there, then something sacred endures. History does not ask who won the war. It asks who learned from it. What remains after war, then, is our answer to that question. Will we rebuild the world as it was fractured, proud, blind, or will we build something newborn, not from power, but from understanding? For the peace that lasts is not written in treaties. It is written in conscience.